The bright studio lights of Fox News illuminated Pam Bondi, Florida's former Attorney General, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, her blonde hair perfectly styled. On a split screen, Representative Jasmine Crockett appeared virtually from her Washington office, wearing a bold red blazer, her expression firm even before the debate began. "Tonight, we're discussing the Justice Reform Act," the host announced, with former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi and Representative Jasmine Crockett. Bondi smiled slightly, eyes fixed on the camera. "Thank you for having me." "Before we go into the details of the bill," the host continued, "Miss Bondi, you've been quite critical of Representative Crockett's position." Bondi didn't hesitate. "Critical is putting it mildly. Representative Crockett's support for this bill is consistent with her entire career, rushing for headlines without a full grasp of basic legal principles. As a former civil rights attorney with limited trial experience before entering politics, she simply lacks the prosecutorial understanding needed to comprehend how this bill would affect law enforcement." The camera caught Crockett's expression, tighten at the personal jab. "With all due respect," Bondi added, though her tone left little doubt otherwise, "when you move from a small law office straight into Congress without ever prosecuting a single criminal case, you shouldn't be leading a complete overhaul of our criminal justice system." "Miss Bondi—" The host tried to interject, but Bondi pressed on. "The American people deserve lawmakers who know how the law functions in reality, not just how it looks in activist headlines." Turning to Crockett, the host said, "Representative, that's a direct challenge to your background. How do you respond?" Crockett leaned forward, her tone measured but firm. "Miss Bondi clearly hasn't done her research on my record, which doesn't surprise me. What will surprise her is what I've brought with me today." She lifted a folder. "Inside are details of my legal work that completely contradict what she just said. And when I'm done, viewers will know exactly who understands justice and who's just repeating talking points." The host raised an eyebrow. "It sounds like we're in for quite a discussion tonight." "It won't be a showdown," Crockett replied confidently. "It'll be a lesson in what happens when you underestimate your opponent." Before diving deeper into the debate between Pam Bondi and Representative Jasmine Crockett, the host reminded viewers, "Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more in-depth political discussions, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our latest analysis." Pam Bondi was not known for launching attacks without preparation. As Florida's first female attorney general, serving from 2011 to 2019, she had earned a reputation for thorough casework and mastery of legal strategy. At 56, she carried herself with the poise of a seasoned prosecutor, having handled everything from consumer fraud to major criminal cases. Her frequent television appearances as a conservative legal analyst had also made her a familiar face in Republican circles. Sitting upright with hands folded neatly, she appeared composed and focused, a professional used to high-stakes legal debate and courtroom scrutiny. Representative Jasmine Crockett, 42, represented a new generation of progressive lawmakers. The freshman Congresswoman from Texas had begun her career as a civil rights attorney before winning her seat in a nationally watched race. Her outspoken advocacy and strong communication skills quickly earned her positions on key House committees. On screen, her Washington office, lined with law books and framed certificates, created a visual contrast to Bondi's critique of her credentials. But the stakes went far beyond personal reputation. The Justice Reform Act they were debating proposed major changes to how federal law enforcement operates, redirecting resources from traditional policing to community intervention programs, creating civilian oversight boards, and establishing new prosecutorial standards. To conservatives like Bondi, the bill weakened the justice system's ability to maintain public safety. To progressives like Crockett, it was a necessary correction to a system that had long treated minority communities unfairly. "Let's set the stage," the host said, aiming to refocus the conversation. "Miss Bondi, you've called this the most dangerous bill proposed in decades. What specifically concerns you?" Bondi adjusted her posture slightly. "This bill gives civilian review boards the power to override decisions made by career prosecutors with years of expertise. It diverts more than $2 billion from proven enforcement programs to untested social initiatives and adds bureaucratic layers that will make prosecuting serious crimes more difficult." Her voice sharpened. Frankly, the fact that Representative Crockett is leading this effort only deepens my concern. Her legal experience simply doesn't prepare her for the real-world consequences of these policies. Turning back to Crockett, the host said, "Those are serious claims, both about the bill and about you personally." Crockett nodded calmly. "They would be serious if they were true," she began. "But Miss Bondi's arguments are based on a fundamental misunderstanding of both the legislation and my career." She lifted the folder again. The Justice Reform Act was drafted with input from over 30 current and former prosecutors, including 3 former U.S. attorneys. Every provision comes from models that have already worked successfully at the state level. Her tone grew sharper. "And as for my qualifications, Miss Bondi seems to think prosecution is the only valid form of legal experience. That mindset is exactly why reform is needed in the first place." The lines had been drawn. This was no longer just a policy disagreement. It had become a direct test of Representative Crockett's credibility and expertise. With national justice reform at stake, the host could sense the rising tension. "Representative Crockett," the host said, "you mentioned having evidence that challenges Miss Bondi's claims about your legal record. Would you like to elaborate?" Crockett offered a measured smile, eyes fixed on the camera. "I'd be glad to," she said. "But first, I think Americans deserve to understand exactly what kind of reform Miss Bondi finds so concerning, and why her criticism of my qualifications says more about her perspective than mine." As the discussion grew more intense, both women spoke with renewed determination, neither willing to back down. "The main problem with this bill," Bondi stated calmly but firmly, "is that it was clearly written by people who have never prosecuted dangerous criminals. When you've never stood before a court facing repeat violent offenders, it's easy to propose reforms that sound idealistic, but endanger communities." She gestured toward her notes. "Section 12 of this legislation would force prosecutors to prove they considered at least 3 alternative sentences before recommending incarceration. That kind of administrative burden would overwhelm district attorney offices across the country." The host turned to Crockett. "Representative, your response?" Crockett nodded slightly, maintaining composure. If Miss Bondi had reviewed the bill carefully, she'd know that Section 12 applies only to nonviolent first-time offenses, not the violent criminals she's referencing to alarm viewers. Her misrepresentation is telling. She lifted a document from her folder. "This is the actual text of Section 12. It explicitly excludes violent crimes and repeat offenders. The provision on alternative sentencing applies only to minor property and low-level drug cases valued under $5,000. Bondi interrupted. "That's a clever way to avoid the issue." "It's not avoidance, it's correction," Crockett replied firmly. "And it highlights the real issue. You're relying on fear rather than facts." The tone in the studio tightened as the exchange became more personal. "Representative Crockett," Bondi said, "you can debate details, but the bigger picture remains. This bill reflects a deep misunderstanding of the criminal justice system. And that's not surprising, given your limited courtroom experience." She lifted her own folder. "I reviewed your career. Before politics, you mostly handled civil rights and low-level defense cases. Important, yes, but not the kind of work that qualifies someone to redesign our federal justice system. In fact, I found records of only 7 jury trials in your career. I handled more than that in my first year as a prosecutor." The camera caught Crockett's calm expression. Not anger, but quiet confidence, as though Bondi had walked into a setup. "Thank you, Miss Bondi," Crockett said evenly. "You've actually helped me make my point." She pulled out several documents. "You mentioned 7 jury trials. That's inaccurate. I've tried 23 cases to verdict, 16 criminal, 7 civil. But what matters most is the impact of those cases." She raised a file. "This was Johnson versus Dallas County, a class action I led that exposed constitutional violations in the county's bail system. The result, systemic reforms that lowered costs and improved outcomes, later cited by the Department of Justice as a model for other states." Holding another document, she continued, "And this was State v. Williams, where I defended a man facing 25 years for a crime he didn't commit. He was acquitted, and my investigation revealed prosecutorial misconduct that triggered reviews of 12 other cases, 5 of which were overturned." Bondi began to respond, but Crockett pressed forward. You argue that prosecution experience is the only valid measure of understanding justice. That belief is exactly the problem. Justice isn't just about convictions, it's about fairness for everyone, the host interjected. Miss Bondi, how do you respond to Representative Crockett's point that her work demonstrates impact, even outside prosecution? Bondi stayed composed, but her voice tightened. Impact litigation is valuable, but it doesn't provide the same understanding of daily criminal prosecution. This bill would make it far harder for prosecutors to keep communities safe. That's exactly the fear-driven thinking I'm talking about, Crockett countered. Here's data from 3 states that implemented similar reforms. In each, both violent and property crime dropped, while saving 12 to 18% in costs. She leaned slightly forward. You're presenting a false choice between justice and safety. The evidence shows we can achieve both, but only by moving past outdated, tough-on-crime policies that filled prisons without making our communities safer. At this point, the debate had evolved beyond policy. It was now a clash of worldviews, Bondi's traditional prosecutorial mindset against Crockett's reform-driven approach. Seeing this, the host added context. We have polling data showing Americans are divided, 48% in favor of this bill, 46% opposed. Clearly, this touches on core national values. Let's talk about the underlying philosophy. Bondi leaned forward. The principle is simple: accountability. Representative Crockett and her allies want to remove consequences from the justice system. Their language about reform and equity sounds appealing, but it would result in criminals returning to the streets faster. She continued, her tone firm. That's what you'd expect from someone whose experience is more about defending offenders than holding them accountable. The remark lingered in the room. The host looked to Crockett, anticipating rebuttal. Crockett smiled faintly. Miss Bondi, I was waiting for that. And since you've gone there, let's clear something up. She lifted another document, this one on official DOJ letterhead. This is a letter from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, commending my work on the Criminal Justice Reform Task Force from 2017 to 2019, work that helped shape this very bill. Her tone remained even but assertive. And since you're so focused on prosecution, let me share something you overlooked. Before founding my law firm, I served 3 years as a special prosecutor for the Harris County District Attorney's Office, handling over 40 felony cases, including violent crimes, while also running my civil rights practice. The camera caught Bondi's subtle reaction, a flicker of surprise breaking her usual composure. So yes, Miss Bondi, Crockett said evenly, I have prosecuted violent offenders and defended the innocent. I've seen justice from both sides. That's exactly why I'm qualified to reform it. The studio fell quiet as the significance of her statement registered. The host turned to Bondi. Miss Bondi, were you aware of Representative Crockett's prosecutorial background? Bondi hesitated. I was aware she had some limited experience. It wasn't limited, Crockett interjected. 3 years, over 40 felony cases, and an 86% conviction rate. You didn't just understate my record, you distorted it to question my credibility. The exchange marked a clear turning point. What began as Bondi's confident critique had shifted, now raising doubts about Bondi's own accuracy and fairness. Crockett's methodical responses had not only defended her record, but revealed dimensions of experience that Bondi either missed or ignored. The host, recognizing the shift, pressed forward. Miss Bondi, you've consistently questioned Representative Crockett's qualifications based on what you described as her limited legal background. Would you like to clarify that position now? Given what we've just learned about her prosecutorial experience, do you still stand by those earlier criticisms? Bondi, an experienced political strategist, attempted to steady herself. 3 years as a special prosecutor doesn't change my central concern. The reforms in this bill would still create serious barriers to effective law enforcement. That's not what I asked. Do you acknowledge that you may have misrepresented Representative Crockett's professional background? The camera zoomed in on Bondi's face, catching the subtle unease, the slight shift in posture and expression that betrayed her awareness of being cornered. I may not have had the full details of her experience at the time. So, you didn't have complete information, yet you felt confident enough to mock my career on national television. This goes to the very heart of our disagreement about justice reform, Ms. Bondi. You made assumptions without knowing the facts. You dismissed my perspective based on those assumptions. And now that they've been proven false, you hesitate to acknowledge it. Crockett held up the Justice Reform Act document. This bill addresses exactly that problem within our justice system. The rush to judgment, the refusal to consider differing viewpoints, and the resistance to admitting when the system gets it wrong. Under the studio's bright lights, Crockett continued dismantling Bondi's arguments with precision. You mocked my limited trial experience, but ignored that one of my cases prompted a review of 12 wrongful convictions. You dismissed my civil rights work as irrelevant, but failed to mention that it helped develop national reform models now widely adopted. She paused deliberately. Most importantly, you've portrayed justice reform as a danger to public safety, when the data clearly show that responsible reforms, like those in this bill, have lowered both crime and recidivism rates where implemented. Recognizing the moment's intensity, the host interjected with a breaking update. We've just received new information relevant to this debate. The National Association of Police Organizations has released a statement on the Justice Reform Act. Both women leaned forward, visibly surprised. While expressing some reservations, NAPO acknowledges that several parts of the legislation reflect best practices already used by progressive police departments nationwide. They specifically praise increased funding for officer training and community engagement programs. This revelation was unexpected. An influential law enforcement group offering even cautious support for provisions Bondi had framed as anti-police. Ms. Bondi, how do you respond to that? I haven't reviewed the full statement yet, so I can't comment on specific provisions. But I still believe this legislation's overall approach would restrict effective policing. The statement is already live on their website. Our team confirmed they praised the training initiatives, community engagement funding, and transparency clauses, all key features of the bill. That's exactly what I've been saying. When people take time to actually read the bill instead of reacting to talking points, they find a lot to support, even among law enforcement professionals. Her tone gained confidence with each sentence. The Justice Reform Act wasn't drafted by idealists disconnected from reality, as Ms. Bondi implied. It was shaped through collaboration by prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, law enforcement officials, and community leaders, people with first-hand experience across the justice system. Then came the decisive moment. Crockett pulled out one final document from her folder. What I'm holding here is a letter signed by 28 current and former prosecutors, including 3 who served under Republican administrations, endorsing the core principles of this bill. And notably, one of the signatories is your former deputy at the Florida Attorney General's office, Michael Simmons. The camera captured Bondi's stunned expression, a rare glimpse of genuine shock. This was clearly something she hadn't expected. Michael believed, as I do, that true justice requires both accountability and fairness, that real law enforcement relies on public trust, and that the reforms in this bill would strengthen, not weaken, our system. The host turned to Bondi, whose confidence had noticeably faded. Miss Bondi, were you aware that your former deputy supports this legislation? I was not, Bondi admitted, her voice losing its earlier certainty. Michael and I have obviously reached different conclusions about the bill. Perhaps, Crockett replied, because he took the time to study what it actually contains, rather than dismissing it based on who introduced it. The studio fell into brief silence. The shift in momentum was unmistakable. What had begun as Bondi's confident critique of Crockett's qualifications had evolved into Crockett's calm, factual exposure of Bondi's lack of preparation and premature judgment. The host, sensing the significance of the moment, asked the question that everyone was waiting for. Miss Bondi, in light of what we've learned about Representative Crockett's background and the growing support this bill has from law enforcement professionals, including your former deputy, do you regret how you characterized both the legislation and Representative Crockett? All eyes were on Bondi. Her hesitation spoke volumes. I still have concerns about certain provisions of the bill, she finally said, her tone more subdued. But I acknowledge that Representative Crockett's experience is more extensive than I had indicated, and I understand that reasonable people, including respected law enforcement leaders, may see value in some of these reforms. It wasn't a full reversal, but from someone who had opened the debate by dismissing Crockett's career, it was a notable retreat. Crockett, instead of pressing further, responded with grace. I appreciate that acknowledgement, Miss Bondi. This is exactly the kind of honest reconsideration our justice system needs, the ability to reevaluate when presented with new information. She held up the Justice Reform Act once more. That's what this bill is truly about. Building a system that values accuracy over speed, fairness over convenience, and justice over mere conviction. Going forward, I hope we can focus on the substance rather than personal attacks. The studio lights softened as Crockett's words hung in the air, a moment of integrity rising above confrontation. The host turned to the camera. Tonight, we witnessed more than a debate. It began with sharp personal exchanges but ended with meaningful dialogue. Maybe there's a lesson here for all of us about how political disagreements should be handled. Across the country, the contrast was clear. Bondi came prepared with personal criticism and left facing a calm, fact-driven opponent who outmaneuvered her through evidence and composure. Within hours, clips of the debate went viral. Hashtags like "Judge Crockett resume" and "Judge receipts ready" trended nationwide. Millions shared the moment where Crockett exposed Bondi's assumptions and defended her record with precision. For Jasmine Crockett, it was a defining career moment. What started as an attempted ambush turned into a demonstration of preparation, clarity, and leadership. The next morning, she appeared on major news programs. When asked about her approach, she said on Good Morning America, "It wasn't about strategy. It was about being prepared with facts instead of assumptions. Too often we attack the messenger instead of addressing the message. I wanted to focus on what truly matters, building a justice system that works for everyone." Her poise earned praise across the political spectrum. A veteran Washington correspondent noted, "This wasn't just a political win. It was a lesson in how to counter personal attacks with professionalism and composure." For Pam Bondi, the aftermath was less forgiving. Conservative commentators who expected her to dominate were largely silent. Some allies quietly distanced themselves from her performance. 3 days later, Michael Simmons, Bondi's former deputy who had signed the letter supporting the Justice Reform Act, gave an interview to the Washington Post. "I was disappointed to see Miss Bondi dismiss the bill without engaging with its content," he said. "Many of us in law enforcement recognize that reforms like these can improve fairness and effectiveness." When asked about Crockett's qualifications, Simmons added, "Her experience as both a prosecutor and a civil rights attorney gives her the balanced perspective we need." The idea that only career prosecutors can understand these issues is part of what needs changing. The interview sent shockwaves through conservative legal circles. Many of Bondi's former colleagues privately admitted concern over her unpreparedness. Meanwhile, the Justice Reform Act itself began gaining new momentum. Prior to the debate, coverage had focused mainly on opposition. Afterward, the national conversation shifted towards substance. Major outlets began publishing detailed analyses of the bill. 3 additional police organizations expressed support for parts of it, while offering measured critiques of others. Within a week, polling showed public support for the bill's core principles had risen from 48% to 57%, with a sharp increase among independent voters. Even more telling, the number of Americans who felt well-informed about the bill nearly doubled. Congressional offices reported a surge in messages referencing the Bondi-Crockett debate as the reason for renewed interest. Politically, Crockett's profile soared. Invitations to speak at universities and policy forums flooded in. Democratic leaders began consulting her on broader legislative matters, recognizing her growing influence and communication skill. Bondi's recovery was slower. After a week of silence, she published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. While I maintain concerns about certain provisions, she wrote, I recognize the genuine effort to address issues in our justice system. Moving forward, I hope all sides focus on policy details rather than personal credentials. Many interpreted it as an attempt to repair her image. Commentators noted the contrast between her combative tone during the debate and her more conciliatory tone afterward. Yet the most lasting impact wasn't personal. It was cultural. The confrontation sparked a more serious, evidence-based national discussion about justice reform. As one Georgetown professor put it, the Bondi-Crockett exchange moved the conversation from who's tougher on crime to what actually works to reduce it. That's real progress. 3 months later, the Justice Reform Act reached the House floor. Despite revisions, its main provisions, including alternative sentencing and increased officer training funds, remained intact. In a surprise outcome, 23 Republicans joined nearly all Democrats in voting to pass the bill. Analysts credited the Bondi-Crockett debate for reframing public understanding and building bipartisan momentum. For Crockett, the moment marked both opportunity and accountability. I never expected that discussion to resonate so deeply, she said in a podcast 6 months later. But it showed that Americans want substance over spectacle. When asked if she harbored resentment toward Bondi, she replied, Honestly, I'm grateful. By questioning my background so directly, she gave me the chance to highlight why diverse legal experience matters. That's what real reform is about. A year later, both women attended the same justice policy conference in Washington. When they crossed paths, attendees braced for tension, but instead saw a brief, respectful handshake. Neither commented publicly. But those nearby said Bondi initiated the exchange and both spoke politely. For many, it symbolized something bigger, that even sharp political divides can give way to mutual respect. As one observer put it, Bondi mocked Crockett and got humbled, but the real victory wasn't personal. It was about shifting the conversation from politics to principles. In a landscape too often defined by division, the Bondi-Crockett confrontation became proof that substance can still triumph over spectacle, and that genuine dialogue can move a nation forward. If you found this analysis insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We bring you thoughtful breakdowns of political moments that truly matter, the ones that shape policy, not just headlines.